Hello and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Lee, and I'm speaking with Ariel Fox, Assistant Professor of Chinese Literature from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Her research explores the intersection of literary and economic imaginaries in late imperial China. Professor Fox is also on the Committee on Theater and Performance Studies. She's here to talk to us about her career path and how she became a University of Chicago professor. So, Ariel, let's start off with an overview of your career path. We can begin in your undergraduate years, and can you take me all the way up to your current role at the University of Chicago?
Sure, yeah, I can definitely try. So I did my undergraduate degree at Columbia, and when I started there, I really thought that I was going to be majoring in political science. I had spent like my whole childhood really fixated on the idea that I was going to be a lawyer, I was going to work for the ACLU. I get to college, and because of AP tests and whatnot, I kind of test out of all of the introductory courses. I end up taking a fairly advanced, like graduate student class on political science. And it was just like so disappointing. It was probably the wrong class for me to take at that particular moment. It was probably my own mistake. But at the time, I was also interested because I had done this summer program when I was in high school that was focused on Chinese culture, history, literature. It was this thing called the New Jersey Scholars Program. It's kind of like, I think a lot of states have things called governor's school. It's similar to that, where students from across the state can apply and do this kind of residential college-like seminar program when they're in high school in the summer. And the topic the year I did, it had to do with China, which I had never really, thought about before in any sustained academic way. So I had really enjoyed this experience because I went to a public high school that was really, it was a really great school, but it had a very sort of limited curriculum, and it was all very sort of, Euro-American focused. So it was really exciting to learn about all the things I didn't know. And so when I went to college, I thought, okay, this would be like my minor. So when my major ended up being sort of deeply disappointing, I ended up finding a lot of, it was really sort of exciting to delve more into the Chinese history and literature side. I sort of ran from the social sciences into the warm embrace of the more sort of humanistic inquiry. So I ended up majoring in East Asian studies at Columbia. I found a really wonderful community of students and scholars there who were really supportive. I also met a lot of graduate students, so I got a sense of what graduate school was like and what it was about, what kinds of things a graduate student does, what kinds of things an academic does, because it was a fairly small department, so I was able to work closely with faculty members there and get to know what their lives were like and what they did. And so after undergrad, I applied for a bunch of fellowships. I ended up doing this thing called the Blakemore, which funds a year of language study abroad, as well as a Fulbright. So I spent 2 years in Beijing after college, where I was, continuing to work on language, continuing to work on, reading the books that I was interested in. And then I applied to graduate programs. I ended up going to Harvard. And then at the end of that, I applied to jobs and got the one at U Chicago. I also had applied to postdocs. And so I received, when I was on the job market, you kind of apply simultaneously to postdocs and jobs. And I got a postdoctoral fellowship at Academia Sinica, which is a research institution in Taiwan. So I was there for a year. U Chicago allowed me to take a year and to work on my research at Academia Sinica before starting at the University of Chicago, where I've been since 2015, I believe. Yes.
So, Ariel, tell me a little bit about what your research interests are. And if you could explain it to me, like I'm a high schooler, that would be awesome.
My research centers around the literature of the late Ming and the early Qing periods, roughly the 17th century. And I'm particularly interested in drama. Drama at this particular moment was extremely, extremely popular. You could see it in any number of contexts. You could see it at the marketplace. You'd see it at a temple, in a private home, in a garden, in the palace. There was a real kind of interest and really kind of craze for drama, which Chinese drama at this particular moment might be better translated as opera. It was all sort of sung. I guess there was dialogue, right? So it wasn't like sort of Western opera where completely sung through, but the emphasis really is on these sort of centerpiece arias. So it's a very musical genre. So tremendously popular both as a written form, as a performance form. People from all different sorts of walks of life were really interested in drama at this particular moment. But one of the things that I always found really interesting about a lot of the dramas, especially the most sort of famous dramas that are talked about in my field, are that this moment, the 17th century, was a moment of tremendous commercial, economic engagement and transformation, especially in the cities and the areas where drama was particularly popular. And a lot of the plays at this time don't really engage with the new kind of economic terrain, the new kinds of social terrains made possible by all of these different sorts of changes that are happening throughout early modern Chinese society. And if they do sort of engage with these questions, they are, often, negative or hostile towards some of the kinds of social transformations that are happening. What I found really interesting was there's a body of plays that were very, very popular at the time and sort of increasingly studied now that take a very different sort of approach to a lot of the transformations that are happening at this particular moment, rather than consigning the merchant to the margins or casting him as a sort of villain who's threatening the scholarly lead. These are plays that move the merchant and his money and commercial exchange to the very center of the plays and find ways to kind of, not just sort of recuperate the sorts of things that merchants are sort of doing and making possible, but to make broader claims about the universality of this experience at this particular moment, the ways in which everyone is becoming a merchant of a sort, is engaged in new forms of social relations that are deeply enmeshed in local and global exchanges, and doing so in ways that open up possibilities rather than sort of anxiously turn away necessarily. So these body of plays I find to be really sort of interesting and compelling to look at very closely, to sort of look at how their narratives work, how their characterization works, and also their sort of reception and publication history. So that's the sort of body of materials that I look at in my first book, which is in production now, which is called The Cornucopian Stage: Performing Commerce in Early Modern China.
So Ariel, how did you realize that this was something that you really wanted to focus on?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's just from, I was just reading a lot of plays, and in my field, there are a handful of plays that have been translated, right? So you encounter them as an undergrad. They are still in various forms in the repertoire, Qunshu performance, the sort of opera troupes that are active now that perform these plays. So there's a sort of canonical body of plays that everyone is very familiar with that operate in a very particular way. So when I started reading a lot more plays, more obscure plays that only exist in perhaps manuscript form, or plays that just were sort of published and forgotten, or perhaps published, and I mean, some of these plays were actually extremely popular and were published repeatedly and transformed in various ways, but they just had not received the same amount of attention necessarily. So just by reading a lot of plays and sort of seeing new patterns emerge, seeing when you get very used to how a particular form or genre works, right? The sort of expectations of, who can be the main character. These plays are often very focused on objects, right? So the plays will often be named for an object, and this object will circulate across the stage. And as various characters interact with this object, they sort of form a community through the circulation recognition of an object. And usually in the plays that are produced in the early modern period, this object is something that is invested with it's a sort of incommensurable object that only somebody with elevated, literati or particularly artisanal knowledge would recognize. And so the communities that are formed are very sort of particular around these incommensurable objects. So when I start to encounter plays where the thing that's circulating is not incommensurable, but infinitely commensurable, right? It's money that's circulating. So instead of this, special fan that has a special inscription and is one of a kind, it's, a bunch of coins. And the sorts of narrative that it's able to create, the sorts of problems and the sorts of communities that form around these objects are radically different than in the other sorts of plays that are more concerned with regenerating, repopulating a certain kind of, social community on stage. So I think it was just, sorry, this is a fairly rambly answer, but I think it's, from just reading a lot and then being able to sort of see when playwrights are playing with the form, when they are altering the form in ways that maybe seem subtle, but are actually, represent fundamental shifts.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that when you were younger, you thought you wanted to be a lawyer. Why was that a goal of yours at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it clearly comes from me not really knowing lawyers. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers now, and I see what actual lawyers do. And I think when I was younger, it was just sort of like what you did or the imagination was, it was what you did if you liked to argue, liked to debate things, right? If you were really engaged with debating ideas with other people, what you do is you become a lawyer. And so I really loved debating. And, when this started quite young. I was really sort of fixated on the idea of being a lawyer. By the time I was in like junior high and high school, I was very active in, debate and mock trial and that sort of stuff. And, I really wanted to, I imagined that I would become a lawyer for something like the ACLU. Like I thought that there were particular kind of like public service things that I could do with this. So I thought that I was really well suited for it. I really enjoyed debating. I really enjoyed writing. So I think that I had a very sort of limited imagination of like what the possibilities were for somebody who enjoyed doing those sorts of things. And I probably got a lot of feedback from people like, oh, you love to debate, or you love to argue, or you love to really chew over a text. You'll be a lawyer. You'll be a great lawyer, that sort of thing. So it really wasn't until I got to college that a world of different sorts of possibilities opened up.
And it sounds like those things that you enjoy, the reading, the arguing, the debating, the mulling over text, that's something that you get to do in your current work, right?
Yeah, precisely. That, it's there are ways in which it very sort of clearly maps on to my younger interests in the sense of interacting with the text very critically, like thinking with the text, thinking against the text, being in a classroom setting and debating with people different sort of ideas and theories and that sort of things. But I mean, also in a very important way, it was quite a departure from what I thought I was good at and what I wanted to do. There was something about when I was taking these classes in college, and part of the reason why I started to work on Chinese, literature and history was in part because Columbia had a language requirement. And I took French in high school and I was terrible at it. And I thought, I had this interest in China from this program that I had done. So what's the opposite of French, right? Like I hated French grammar. So I thought Chinese, right? Chinese does not have grammar, anything approaching like French grammar. So I thought maybe I'll be good at Chinese. I was wrong. I was bad at Chinese. And there was something about doing something that I was bad at and sort of committing to it. Being an academic didn't really necessarily feel, even at the time, even though I was very excited by the prospect, it never really felt like necessarily a good fit for my personality. It's very solitary. It's very, especially in my field, it's very sort of intensively linguistically sort of rooted, right? And I really sort of struggled with that particular aspect. So I think at the time I had a fairly romantic idea that I should do something that I'm bad at, that I should challenge myself, and it would be more important for me as a person to, I guess, struggle against myself in particular ways, which sounds a bit silly now, but at the time it kept me going, I guess, when I found myself, really, really sort of struggling with some of the aspects of being an academic.
Well, related to that point, why be an academic? Because there are many things you could be with the skills and the interests that you just laid out.
Right. Good question. I mean, I think that there were things that I loved about it as well. I mean, there's the being able to just spend as much time as I wanted with a question or a problem or a text, that kind of freedom, that kind of space. And I really loved being in seminar and talking with people and meeting individually with professors. And then, so just knowing that when you're an academic, you have these kinds of conversations that operate on various different levels, these conversations that you're having with yourself, with as much time as you want to sort of spend with reading a text and thinking about a text, with your colleagues, with other people in the field, with students, undergrad, graduate students, and, these varied kinds of conversations that you can have without, there's obviously pressures, right, that come with being an academic, but there's something expansive about what the academy offered in terms of time and space to think about real and serious things.
Let's talk about what are the fun parts of your job.
Oh, there's a lot of really fun parts. I mean, teaching, of course, is really fun. To be able to design classes that have a particular shape to them, where you're taking students on a kind of intellectual journey with you through the material, getting to share. I mean, because, some of the stuff that I work on is just so much fun. I teach a lot of novels and short stories, and to be there when students are encountering them and excited by them, and thinking through all of the sort of issues and implications of the things that we're encountering is really wonderful. And also to be surprised continually by my students by what they pick up on in a text that I've never seen before, or how they make connections, across other fields. So I think that that's always like really sort of satisfying to sort of experience. And the University of Chicago is particularly wonderful in that regard, both because of the quarter system, which can be a bit intense for the students because they're taking 3 quarters over the course of the academic year. For faculty, it's really wonderful because you get to create these small classes. There's kind of a culture at the university of more focused classes because we only have a 9-week quarter. You don't really teach classes that you might find at other universities, like Introduction to Chinese Literature or something like that. We teach classes that might just be about a novel or about a short story collection or about one play. And then over the course of those 9 weeks, you delve into all these different things that kind of surround this one text or body of text. So it allows you to not feel like you have to cram all sorts of information in, but to really move about a topic in a really interesting and novel kind of way.
So on the flip side of that, Ariel, what are the things that you don't enjoy, like the not fun things about this job?
Yeah, so in terms of things that I don't particularly enjoy about the job, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily related to my job per se, but the academic job market has been particularly brutal the last few years, especially coming off of COVID. We're lucky in my field that there is still a decent amount of hiring that's being done in, Chinese literature, Chinese culture. We've done a good job, I think, placing our students in positions, but it's always difficult helping students through the sort of anxieties and the difficulties of the job search process, which is, why if you're considering a career in the academy, it's a sort of wonderful career. There are so many wonderful things you can do with it, but being aware of also the particular kinds of pressures and the seemingly increasingly limited job prospects, honestly, is something that needs to be considered. And so, that's a difficulty, right, of sort of helping students through that process. I mean, it is fulfilling in a way as well, right? Being able to support students through that process and generally to see them end up in a place that they're happy in. But that's the sort of particularities of, a PhD in the humanities at this particular moment.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, aside from making sure that you're aware of the realities of the job market, what other advice would you have for students interested in pursuing a similar path, a similar role that you have now?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good piece of advice, and it was advice that I was given and that I took, and I probably could have taken it even further, but that, don't go right through. Don't do your BA and immediately start a PhD program. If you have other options open to you, it's good to take a break. It's good for your intellectual development. It's good for your sort of, psychological well-being. It's good to just, take a moment and work someplace else, or, do something else, or do something related, rather than, graduate school is so intense. It requires a really kind of single-minded focus. It ends up kind of consuming all different kinds of areas of your life. And so to have a space to breathe and think about, what it is that you're interested in, rather than sort of, rushing into a PhD program. I understand that the pressures that people face, that it's unclear what people want to do next. So sometimes people see a graduate program as a way to find the thing that they want to do next. But I would just caution to, slow down a little bit and think about it, even if you're 100% certain that's what you want to do. I was 100% certain that's what I wanted to do, but I also wanted to take some time to read more, to think more, to get myself in a better position in terms of, my abilities in classical Chinese and that sort of thing. So the kinds of things that you can do in that space in between undergrad and graduate school will help you down the road if you do end up pursuing a career in academia. And then another thing would be, especially for undergraduate students who are interested in pursuing a career in the academy, is to don't fear the office hours. I think there's, I've encountered a lot of students at the University of Chicago who are generally, go-getting students, bold students, but there's a sense that you only go to office hours if you have something really pressing to talk about. There's a sense of sort of discomfort around office hours as if you're, interrupting the professor or something like that. But I would really encourage students who are interested in academia or to have questions about it. What is it like to be a professor? What do the different terms mean? I've encountered so many students who have no idea what's an assistant professor, what's an associate professor. These are sort of, really kind of opaque terms to them. Just to stop in, just to make an appointment with a professor who you feel connected with or would like to connect with, and just to ask them questions. You don't need to have any particular goal for that meeting or a particular question, but I think that they would really welcome that kind of interaction. It would really help demystify the process.
So Ariel, finally, I want to ask you, how do you think the time that you spent abroad, the time in China and the time in Taiwan, really benefited not only your career, but you as a person?
Yeah, I mean, the time that I spent abroad was truly invaluable in every sense. I went to Beijing after college before graduate school, and then I was in Shanghai for a number of years during graduate school, and I was finishing my dissertation in Shanghai and Suzhou, and I was working on my dissertation. And then after at Academia Sinica in Taipei, and then of course I've gone on many research trips since then. And yeah, I mean, of course, just a sort of obvious, the tremendous leap in my language ability from spending time there, the access to materials, and of course, the access to a huge world of scholars who are engaged in the questions that I'm interested in. East Asian departments in the United States are fairly small. Like you're not going to get, University of Chicago is a particularly special case in that, I have a colleague who works on something very similar to what I work on, Judith Zeitlin, but most university departments, you're going to be the only one who works on, say, early modern Chinese literature or modern Chinese literature. And when you go abroad, when you go to China, when you go to Taiwan, there are massive departments of people with tons of graduate students who are doing exciting, cutting edge work, fascinating work on your field. So you're able to have conversations with just so many more people, and it really kind of opens up because the different academies or different places have different ways that they approach scholarship, that they think about like what are the kinds of questions that an academic asks. And so it's really good to engage with different academic communities that challenge your idea of what does a professor work on, what are the interesting questions in the field right now, what are the materials available. So it's kind of really wonderful in that regard, and really opening up the kinds of questions and projects that you can work on. So yeah, I mean, I've taught at the Chicago Beijing Center a few times, and that's always just been such a sort of wonderful experience. And so I would really encourage students to study abroad, to travel abroad, to live abroad, especially when they have a sort of academic interest, right, that it will really help deepen your sort of holistic understanding of what it is that you're interested in.
Thank you, Professor Ariel Fox, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. Leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for listening.